The bell above the diner door rang sharply, signaling the arrival of Jake Harper, a young man with eyes full of worry. But today, the familiar atmosphere of coffee and bacon was shattered as a mysterious man in a leather jacket stepped in, his voice cold and cutting. "I'm looking for Jake Harper." That single sentence silenced the entire diner and left Jake breathless. Who was this man, and why was he looking for Jake? But before diving into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next ones. The bell above the diner door jingled sharply as Jake stepped inside, his boots scuffing against the worn linoleum floor. The faint aroma of fried bacon and brewing coffee filled the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation from the scattered patrons. Jake ran a hand through his unruly hair and sighed, his broad shoulders tense as he spotted his mother, Sarah, standing behind a counter. Her face was etched with focus, her fingers flying across the calculator as she balanced the paper. Sarah didn't look up. "Jake, you're late," she said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and reprimand. I know, Mom. Sorry," Jake replied, his tone softer than he intended. He moved quickly behind the counter, grabbing a dishcloth from the sink without waiting for her to press the issue. Sarah's sharp eyes flicked to him for a moment, then back to the mountain of papers in front of her. "We've got a lunch rush coming in half an hour, and the tables still need wiping. Next time, don't make me chase you down, okay?" Jake nodded, biting back a defensive response. He knew she didn't mean to be hard on him. It was just the stress talking. The diner was their livelihood and every dollar counted. With his father long gone and bills piling up, Sarah didn't have the luxury of letting things slide. Jake picked up the pace, wiping down tables and stacking plates with practiced efficiency. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as he worked, but his mind was elsewhere. The truth was, Jake wasn't just late because he'd lost track of time. He'd been sitting in the back of the school parking lot for over an hour, staring at the crumpled math worksheet in his lap. His teacher's voice still echoed in his head, the words barely passing, ringing louder than the taunts of his classmates. But telling Sarah about his struggles at school felt like handing her another weight to carry, and she already had enough. "Everything okay, kid?" Sarah's voice snapped him back to the present. She was leaning against the counter now, watching him with the kind of concern that made his stomach twist. "Yeah, fine," Jake lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Sarah didn't press him. Instead, she glanced at the clock. "All right, grab an apron. The regulars will be in soon, and God knows if Earl starts complaining about his coffee again, I'll lose it." Jake smirked faintly, grateful for the shift in focus, but the reprieve was short-lived. The moment he tied the apron around his waist, the diner door swung open again, slamming hard enough against the wall to make the bell jangle wildly. Everyone turned to look. A man in a leather jacket and dark sunglasses strode in, his presence commanding the small space. Jake stiffened, his hands gripping the dishcloth like a lifeline. Something about the man set off alarm bells in Jake's head. His deliberate movements, the way his gaze swept the room like he was searching for someone. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the counter behind her as if bracing for impact. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Jake Harper. You wouldn't happen to know where I could find him, would you?" The air in the diner grew thick, heavy with tension. Jake felt every pair of eyes in the room shift to him. His pulse quickened, and his stomach churned. Whoever this man was, he wasn't here for a friendly chat. Sarah stepped forward, her protective instincts kicking in. "Why are you looking for my son?" she asked, her tone sharp now, all pretense of politeness gone. The man tilted his head, his expression amused. "That's between me and him, ma'am. Now, if you could just point him out, I'd appreciate it." Jake took a step forward before his mother could respond. His jaw clenched. "I'm Jake," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of nerves raging inside him. "What do you want?" The man's smile widened, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough," he said cryptically. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, the bell above the door ringing in his wake. A hasp and a song permeated from a voice from somewhere, some indistinct sound in her face from some kind of cloud and air, and Sally was dancing with joy, but in a way she knew best to hide because he seemed so beckoning to her. Jake's hands were trembling now, and Sarah reached for him, her eyes wide with worry. "Jake, who was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Jake admitted, his mind racing, but deep down he had a feeling this was just the beginning of something far bigger than he could imagine. The diner was nearly deserted as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows. Jake wiped the counter absently, his mind still replaying the unsettling visit from the stranger the day before. The bell above the door jingled, snapping him out of his thoughts. A man in a crisp navy suit stepped inside, his movements stiff and deliberate. He looked out of place in the modest diner, his polished leather shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor. "Coffee," the man said, his voice low but firm as he slid onto a stool at the counter. Jake grabbed a mug and filled it from the pot on the warmer. As he placed it in front of the man, he noticed his hands trembling slightly as they reached for the cup. "You okay, sir?" Jake asked cautiously. The man glanced up, his eyes weary. "Rough day," he muttered, before taking a sip. Jake didn't press further, but the man's unease lingered in the air. The suit was tailored, expensive, yet the man's slumped posture and distracted demeanor hinted at something unraveling beneath the polished surface. "Let me know if you need anything," Jake said, his voice trailing off as he moved to wipe down the tables. The man stayed for a while, nursing his coffee in silence, before paying in cash and disappearing out the door. Later that evening, Jake trudged up the narrow stairs to their cramped apartment above the dry cleaners. The space was small and suffocating, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew that no amount of cleaning could banish. Sarah was sitting at the small kitchen table, a stack of overdue bills spread out before her. The sight of her, her shoulders hunched and her brow furrowed in concentration, made Jake's chest tighten. "You eat anything yet?" he asked, dropping his bag by the door. Sarah didn't look up. "I'm fine, Jake. Just trying to figure out which bill gets paid this month and which one has to wait." Jake hated the way her voice sounded. Tired, resigned. It wasn't fair. She worked harder than anyone he knew, yet it never seemed to be enough. He wanted to say something, to promise her things would get better, but the words stuck in his throat. The next morning, Jake left early for school, his backpack slung over one shoulder. As he stepped into the hallway, his stomach dropped. Taped to their front door was a stark white eviction notice, the bold black letters glaring at him like an accusation. For a moment, he just stood there, his mind racing. He couldn't let Sarah see this, not today, not with everything else weighing her down. He tore the notice off the door, crumpling it in his fist before shoving it deep into his pocket. At school, he barely paid attention. The math problems on the board blurred together, and his classmates' chatter felt distant. All he could think about was the notice, the way it threatened to pull the rug out from under them. After school, Jake decided to clear his head by taking the long way home. As he turned onto a quieter street, he spotted a familiar figure hunched over the hood of a car. It was the man from the diner. The one in the suit. His jacket was off, draped over the driver's seat, and his tie hung loose around his neck. Steam billowed from the car's hood, and he was muttering curses under his breath. Jake approached cautiously. "Need help?" he asked. The man looked up, startled, then sighed. "Radiator's leaking," he said, gesturing at the stream of coolant pooling under the car. "You know anything about cars?" "A bit," Jake said with a shrug. He dropped his bag on the ground and leaned over the hood. The engine was still hot, and the acrid smell of burnt coolant stung his nose. After a moment of inspection, he stood back. "I can patch it up for now, but you'll need a proper fix soon." The man nodded, stepping aside as Jake pulled a roll of duct tape from his bag. He worked quickly, sealing the crack as best he could. When he was done, he wiped his hands on his jeans and stepped back. "Should hold until you get to a mechanic," Jake said. The man exhaled a breath of relief. "You saved me a tow," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Let me pay you." Jake shook his head. "Don't worry about it." The man hesitated, then extended a hand. "Tom Harrison," he said. "Jake Harper," Jake replied, shaking his hand. Tom studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You're a good kid, Jake. Thanks for the help." Jake nodded, watching as Tom climbed into the car and drove off. The encounter left him with a strange sense of unease. There was something about Tom, something beyond the broken radiator and the trembling hands, that didn't sit right. By the time Jake got home, the tension in his chest had only grown. Sarah was at the table again, this time with a cup of tea and the same stack of bills. She smiled faintly when she saw him, but the worry in her eyes was unmistakable. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Jake said quickly, dropping his bag by the door. "Just tired." Sarah didn't push, but Jake could feel her watching him as he moved around the apartment. The eviction notice burned in his pocket, a silent reminder of the storm looming over them. The next day, Jake was back at the diner, clearing tables during the lunch rush. His hands moved on autopilot, but his mind was elsewhere. Tom's words from the day before echoed in his head. "You're a good kid." The bell above the door jingled, and Jake looked up instinctively. Tom Harrison stepped inside, his suit looking more wrinkled than before. His expression was tense, his eyes darting around the diner as if searching for someone. "Coffee, please," Tom said, sliding onto the same stool as before. As Jake poured him a cup, he noticed the tremor in Tom's hands had returned, worse than the day before. "You sure you're okay?" Jake asked, lowering his voice. Tom looked up, his eyes heavy with something Jake couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. "Just a lot going on," Tom said, his voice tight. He hesitated, then added, "Thanks for helping me out yesterday. I owe you one." Before Jake could respond, Tom's phone buzzed loudly on the counter. He glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened. Without a word, he grabbed his coffee and hurried out the door, leaving Jake standing there with more questions than answers. Something wasn't adding up, and Jake's gut told him that whatever trouble Tom Harrison was in, it was only a matter of time before it spilled over into his own life. The next morning, the diner hummed with the usual breakfast rush. The clatter of plates and the low murmur of conversations filled the air as Jake moved between tables, pouring coffee and clearing plates. He kept his head down, his mind clouded with thoughts of overdue bills and the eviction notice still hidden in his backpack. Then the bell above the door jingled. Jake glanced up and froze. Tom Harrison stood in the doorway, his sharp suit a stark contrast to the diner's modest interior. His eyes scanned the room until they locked on Jake. Without hesitation, he strode toward the counter, drawing the attention of a few curious customers. "Ora, Jake," Tom said, sliding onto a stool. His tone was lighter than the last time, but his gaze carried the same intensity. "Morning," Jake replied cautiously, grabbing a mug and filling it with coffee. Car holding up okay? It's fine, thanks to you, Tom said, wrapping his hands around the mug. He paused, his expression softening. Look, I wanted to say something. What you did, for someone you don't even know, that's rare these days. Most people wouldn't have bothered. Jake shrugged, feeling heat rise to his face. It wasn't a big deal. It was a big deal, Tom insisted, leaning forward slightly. You helped me when you didn't have to. That says a lot about your character. Before Jake could respond, Sarah appeared behind the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. She eyed Tom suspiciously. Jake helps people all the time, she said, her voice cool. That's just who he is. Tom turned to her, offering a polite smile. You must be his mom. That's right, Sarah said, crossing her arms. And you are? Tom Harrison, he said, extending a hand. Sarah hesitated before shaking it. I wanted to talk to Jake about an opportunity. Sarah's eyes narrowed. What kind of opportunity? Tom ignored the edge in her voice, turning back to Jake. I run a dealership a few towns over, he said. We're always looking for sharp, hard-working people. And after yesterday, it's clear you've got a good head on your shoulders. Jake blinked, caught off guard. You're offering me a job? Not just a job, Tom said, his tone earnest. A real chance. You'd work at the dealership part-time, learn the ropes, and if you're interested, I'll cover the cost of sending you to a technical school to get certified as a mechanic. The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Jake's heart raced at the thought of something more, something better than endless shifts at the diner and a mountain of unpaid bills. But before he could say anything, Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts like a knife. And what's the catch? She asked, her tone sharp. Tom raised an eyebrow. There's no catch. Sarah wasn't convinced. Opportunities like this don't just fall into people's laps without strings attached. Jake's chest tightened as he glanced between them. Mom? No, Jake, Sarah interrupted, her eyes locked on Tom. We've been through enough to know when something sounds too good to be true. Tom met her gaze steadily. I understand your concern, he said, but I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. I see potential in your son. I'm just offering him a chance to use it. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. The tension was thick, the silence stretching until Jake finally broke it. Mom, we don't have a choice, he said, his voice firm. We need this. Sarah turned to him, her expression softening slightly. Jake, I don't want you to get hurt or worse, taken advantage of. I'll be fine, Jake insisted. You've always said I should take chances when they come. Well, this is one of them. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. All right, she said finally, but I'm holding you to your word, Mr. Harrison. You have my word, Tom said, his tone steady. The next day, Jake found himself standing in front of Tom's dealership, a sleek, modern building surrounded by rows of shiny cars. The sight was almost overwhelming, a far cry from the dingy diner and their cramped apartment. Tom greeted him at the entrance, his smile warm but professional. Glad you made it, he said, clapping Jake on the shoulder. Come on, I'll show you around. Jake followed Tom inside, taking in the bustling atmosphere. Salespeople moved between desks, chatting with customers, while mechanics worked in the garage visible through a glass partition. Tom led Jake to a small office and handed him a uniform. You'll start in the garage, Tom explained. Learn the basics, get your hands dirty. If you stick with it, we'll talk about moving you up. Jake nodded, his excitement growing. The prospect of learning a trade, of building something for himself, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Over the next few weeks, Jake threw himself into the work. The garage became his second home, the clatter of tools and the hum of engines of comforting rhythm. He learned quickly, earning the respect of the other mechanics and even a few of the salespeople. Do you have any questions? Leave a comment. I will try to answer all. But not everything was smooth sailing. Sarah remained skeptical, her worry spilling over into their conversations at home. "Sure about this, Jake?" she asked one night as they sat at the kitchen table. "I just don't want you to get your hopes up." "I am sure, Mom," Jake said, his voice steady. "Tom's been nothing but honest with me. And for the first time, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Sarah sighed but didn't argue. She knew better than to stand in his way when he was determined. One evening, as Jake was closing up the garage, Tom appeared at the door. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by something more guarded. "Jake, can I talk to you for a second?" he asked. "Sure," Jake said, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's up?" Tom hesitated, then stepped closer. "I need a favor," he said, quietly. "It's personal." Jake frowned. "What kind of favor?" Tom glanced around, ensuring they were alone. "There's a situation I need help with. It involves someone I care about. Someone in trouble." Jake's pulse quickened. "What kind of trouble?" Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Jake. "Read this when you get home," he said. "And if you decide you're in, meet me tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. I'll explain everything." Jake stared at the paper, his mind racing. He wanted to ask more questions, but Tom was already walking away. That night, Jake unfolded the paper in his room. The words written there made his stomach churn. Whatever Tom was asking for, it wasn't simple, and it definitely wasn't safe. But as he looked around the tiny apartment, at the peeling wallpaper and the stack of bills on the table, he made his decision. Jake started at the dealership with a mix of nerves and determination. His first few days were grueling, hours spent scrubbing cars until his fingers were raw, hauling tools back and forth in the garage, and taking orders from seasoned employees who barely acknowledged his existence. It wasn't glamorous, but Jake kept his head down and pushed through, refusing to let the skepticism around him take root. The loudest doubter was Mark, a senior mechanic with a sharp tongue and an even sharper attitude. Mark had a habit of making his opinions known, especially when Tom Harrison wasn't around. "Harrison's charity project, huh?" Mark sneered one afternoon as Jake wiped down the interior of a luxury sedan. "Don't get too comfortable, kid. Guys like you don't last long around here." Jake didn't respond, though his grip on the cleaning rag tightened. He knew Mark was testing him, waiting for a reaction. But Jake wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. Instead, he doubled down, focusing on the task at hand and letting his work speak for itself. Weeks passed, and Jake's efforts began to pay off. Despite the cold reception from some employees, others started noticing his dedication. He learned quickly, absorbing every bit of knowledge like a sponge. He asked questions, stayed late to finish jobs, and even picked up extra shifts when needed. Tom Harrison, true to his word, kept a close eye on him, occasionally pulling him aside for encouragement. "You're doing good work, Jake," Tom said one evening as they stood by the garage, the smell of oil and grease hanging in the air. "But this is just the beginning. With the right training, you could turn this into a real career." Jake nodded, a flicker of pride in his chest. He'd never had anyone outside his family believe in him like this, and it pushed him to work even harder. When Tom handed Jake the application for technical school, it felt like a turning point. The form represented more than just an education. It was a chance to build something lasting, a way out of the endless cycle of struggle. Jake hesitated only for a moment before signing his name at the bottom. The ink barely dried before he was juggling dealership shifts, classes, and his regular stints at the diner to help Sarah. The schedule was brutal, Jake woke up before dawn to catch the first bus to school, spent hours in the classroom learning the intricacies of engines and diagnostics, then rushed to the dealership for his evening shifts. By the time he got home, it was often past midnight, and he barely had the energy to collapse onto his bed before doing it all over again. But he didn't complain. Every long day, every sleepless night felt like a step towards something better. Sarah noticed the change in him, the spark of purpose in his eyes, the way he carried himself with more confidence. She still worried, of course, but she couldn't deny the transformation. "I'm proud of you," she told him one night as they sat at the kitchen table, the eviction notice still taped to the fridge as a silent reminder of what they were up against. "But don't burn yourself out, Jake. You're only one person." "I'm fine, Mom," Jake assured her. "We're getting through this, one step at a time." Not everyone was rooting for him, though. Mark, ever the cynic, seemed to take Jake's progress as a personal challenge. He started finding ways to undermine him. Small things at first, like accidentally misplacing tools Jake needed, or assigning him the dirtiest, most menial jobs in the garage. One evening, after Jake had spent hours cleaning a car that had clearly seen the worst of road trips, Mark cornered him near the tool bench. "You think Harrison's gonna hand you the keys to the dealership just 'cause you've got a sob story?" Mark said, his voice low and cutting. "This place isn't a charity, kid. Sooner or later, you'll screw up, and we'll all see you for what you really are." Jake clenched his jaw, the weight of exhaustion and frustration threatening to boil over. But instead of snapping back, he met Mark's glare head-on. "Maybe," Jake said evenly, "but at least I'm trying." The simple response seemed to catch Mark off guard, and for the first time, he didn't have a comeback. Jake turned away, his heart pounding, and got back to work. The breaking point came a few weeks later. It was a busy Friday night at the dealership, and Jake was tasked with prepping several cars for a weekend showcase. He was halfway through detailing an SUV when one of the mechanics called out sick, leaving the garage short-staffed. Tom, clearly stressed but trusting Jake's capabilities, asked him to step in. "Can you handle it?" Tom asked, his expression serious. "Yes, sir," Jake said without hesitation. It was a trial by fire. Jake spent hours diagnosing a tricky engine issue on a customer's car while still managing to finish his detailing work. By the time the night was over, his clothes were covered in grease, his hands raw from scrubbing, but the job was done, and done well. When Tom reviewed his work the next day, he pulled Jake aside. "Not bad, Harper," Tom said with a rare grin. "Not bad at all." Jake couldn't help but smile, the praise feeling like a hard-won victory. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. As Jake continued to prove himself, even Mark began to grudgingly acknowledge his efforts. He stopped the snide remarks and started offering the occasional tip or piece of advice. It wasn't friendship, but it was progress. Jake's balancing act wasn't without its challenges, though. The long hours and constant pressure began to take a toll. There were moments when he questioned if it was all worth it, if he was strong enough to keep going. But every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself of the eviction notice on the fridge, of Sarah's tired but hopeful smile, of Tom's belief in him. Those were the things that kept him moving forward. The true test came on a rainy afternoon when a high-profile client brought in a luxury car with an electrical issue that none of the senior mechanics could figure out. Tom, after watching his team struggle for hours, turned to Jake. "Think you can take a crack at it?" he asked. Jake hesitated, the weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just any job. This was a chance to prove he was more than just a charity project. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. The garage fell silent as Jake worked, the other mechanics watching from the sidelines. Every move he made was deliberate, Every connection he checked triple verified. Sweat dripped down his brow as he traced the problem back to a faulty relay in the car's central system. When the engine roared to life, a ripple of surprise and grudging respect passed through the crowd. Tom's grin was wide, his pride unmistakable. "Now that's what I'm talking about," Tom said, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "You've got the makings of a real mechanic, kid." Jake's chest swelled with a mix of relief and accomplishment. He'd done it. For the first time, he felt like he'd truly earned his place. The weeks that followed felt like a blur of progress and hard-earned milestones for Jake. Each day in the garage brought new challenges, and with each one he faced, his confidence grew. He no longer felt out of place or like an outsider. The tools felt natural in his hands, the hum of the engines, a language he was finally fluent in. Louise, one of the dealership's most respected senior mechanics, had been watching Jake's transformation closely. Initially reserved, Louise was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it carried weight. One afternoon, as Jake was finishing a complicated brake replacement on an SUV, Louise approached, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag. He inspected Jake's work with a critical eye before giving a satisfied nod. "You're getting good, kid," Louise said, his tone gruff but genuine. Jake's chest swelled with pride. "Thanks, Louise. That means a lot." Louise smirked faintly, tossing the rag onto his workbench. "Don't let it go to your head. There's always more to learn, but you're on the right track." That brief exchange stayed with Jake, fueling his determination to keep improving. The acknowledgement from someone as skilled as Louise felt like a badge of honor. Meanwhile, Jake's progress at school mirrored his achievements at the dealership. The long hours of studying and hands-on work were paying off. He aced his practical exams and began earning top marks in his classes. His instructors took notice, often using Jake as an example for his peers. Balancing the dealership, school, and helping at the diner wasn't easy, but Jake found a rhythm. Sarah, though still cautious, started to relax as she saw the positive changes in him. She even began to believe that this opportunity wasn't just a fleeting stroke of luck, but a real chance for Jake to carve out a better future. "You're making me proud, Jake," Sarah said one evening as they shared a late dinner at the kitchen table. Her voice was soft, the kind of tone she rarely allowed herself to use. "Your dad would have been proud too." Jake nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Thanks, Mom. I just want us to be okay." "We will be," Sarah said with quiet conviction. "You're making sure of that." The turning point came during a dealership event meant to showcase their services to high-end clients. The garage was spotless, every surface gleaming as if polished to perfection. Tom had personally asked Jake to be part of the team assisting during the event, a sign of trust that wasn't lost on him. As the event unfolded, Jake was stationed near the garage entrance, ready to assist if needed. Toward the middle of the afternoon, a sleek, foreign luxury car pulled into the lot. Its driver, a sharp-dressed man with an impatient air, immediately demanding attention. "I've got an important meeting in an hour," the man barked, tossing his keys to a service advisor. "And this thing is giving me some kind of error message. Fix it!" The advisor looked flustered, but before he could respond, Jake stepped forward. "I can take a look," he said confidently, meeting the man's sharp gaze. The client raised an eyebrow but waved Jake on. "Just make it quick." Jake popped the hood and quickly ran diagnostics. The issue was tricky, but his training kicked in. He worked methodically, tracing the problem to a faulty sensor that required a temporary recalibration. His hands moved with precision, the hours spent in the garage and at school guiding his every action. 20 minutes later, the engine purred to life without a hiccup. Jake closed the hood and turned to the client, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're good to go, sir. It was a sensor issue, but it's been recalibrated. You shouldn't have any more problems." The man seemed momentarily stunned, then offered a grudging nod of approval. "Impressive," he said. Most places would have taken hours to figure that out." Jake nodded politely. "Glad I could help." Tom had been watching the exchange from a distance. As Jake returned to his station, Tom approached, clapping him on the back with a grin. "You handled that like a pro," he said. "You keep this up and there's no telling how far you'll go." Jake couldn't suppress the smile that spread across his face. It was moments like this that made all the hard work worthwhile. Shortly after the event, Tom called Jake into his office. The space was sleek and professional, with a wall of windows overlooking the bustling dealership floor. "You've been doing exceptional work, Jake," Tom began, leaning back in his chair. "You've gone above and beyond what I expected. The way you handled that client's car at the event, that was top tier." "Thank you, sir," Jake said, his hands resting nervously in his lap. Tom smiled. "You've earned this," he said, sliding a paper across the desk. "Effective immediately, you're being promoted to apprentice mechanic. It comes with a raise, of course, and more responsibility, but I have no doubt you're ready for it." Jake stared at the paper, the weight of the moment sinking in. This wasn't just a title. It was proof that his hard work was paying off. "I won't let you down," he said, his voice steady. Tom chuckled. "You haven't so far. I don't expect you to start now." The promotion marked a new chapter for Jake. He was no longer just the kid cleaning cars or running errands. He was part of the team, trusted to handle real repairs and tackle complex problems. Luis, ever the mentor, began giving Jake more advanced tasks, pushing him to hone his skills even further. "You've come a long way, kid," Luis said one evening as they wrapped up a repair. "Keep it up, and you'll be better than me in no time." Jake laughed. "I don't know about that, Luis. You're a legend around here." "Legends retire," Luis said with a wink. "The future belongs to guys like you." At home, things were finally starting to stabilize. Jake's raise allowed them to catch up on bills, and for the first time in years, Sarah seemed less burdened. The eviction notice was finally torn down and replaced with a small calendar where Jake marked his milestones, paydays, exam dates, and the occasional dealership event. One night, as they sat in the living room, Sarah turned to Jake with a rare smile. "I'm starting to believe this isn't just a dream," she said. "You're really making a life for yourself, Jake." Jake looked at her, his eyes shining with determination. "It's not just for me, Mom. It's for us." At the dealership, Jake's reputation continued to grow. He became the go-to guy for tricky diagnostics, his ability to problem-solve earning him respect, even from skeptics like Mark. "You proved me wrong, Harper," Mark admitted one day begrudgingly. "You're not just some charity case. You've got talent." "Thanks, Mark," Jake replied, his tone humble but firm. He wasn't one to hold grudges, and earning Mark's respect felt like another victory. As the weeks turned into months, Jake couldn't help but reflect on how far he'd come, from scrubbing cars and dodging insults to becoming an apprentice mechanic with a future ahead of him. The journey had been anything but easy. But standing in the garage one evening, watching the sun set through the large windows, Jake felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. He knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, he felt ready to face them. And as the engines roared to life around him, he realized he wasn't just building cars. He was building a life. The conference was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. The air buzzed with energy, a blend of innovation and ambition that seemed to electrify the massive hall. Rows of gleaming cars lined the venue, each boasting cutting-edge technology and sleek designs. Jake wandered through the displays, his awe barely concealed. Tom had insisted he come along, calling it an opportunity to see what's possible. And as Jake moved from booth to booth listening to engineers and industry leaders speak, he began to understand what Tom meant. One session stood out above the rest. Peter Caldwell, a renowned figure in the automotive world, took the stage. With his silver hair and commanding presence, Caldwell exuded authority, but his words carried a humility that resonated deeply. Hard work, mistakes, and not being afraid to ask for help, that's the key, Caldwell said, pacing across the stage. No one gets to the top alone. You have to be willing to learn, to fail, and to get back up again. Jake hung on every word. Caldwell's message wasn't just about cars. It was about life. It reminded Jake of his own journey, the countless hours he'd spent in the garage, the mistakes he'd made, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. As the session ended, Jake turned to Tom, who was watching him with a knowing smile. "What did I tell you?" Tom said, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "This world is bigger than you think, and there's a place for you in it." Back at the dealership, life carried on at its usual pace. Jake returned to his routine, but the conference had left a mark on him. He worked with renewed vigor, tackling every repair with the same determination that had brought him this far. His confidence was growing, and so was his reputation. Customers began asking for him by name, and his co-workers, even Mark, treated him with respect. One crisp autumn morning, Tom called Jake into his office. The moment Jake stepped inside, he noticed a letter sitting prominently on Tom's desk. His name was printed on the envelope, the logo of the advanced technical program in the corner. Tom grinned, sliding the letter across the desk. "Go on, open it." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he tore open the envelope. His eyes scanned the words, his breath catching as he reached the line that mattered most. "Congratulations, you've been accepted." He looked up at Tom, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, I got in." "Of course you did," Tom said, leaning back in his chair. "You've earned this, Jake, every bit of it. But remember, this is just another step. Keep going." Jake nodded, the weight of the moment sinking in. The program was an opportunity to specialize, to hone his skills further, and open doors he hadn't even dreamed of. It was everything he'd worked for, and then some. At home, the changes were just as significant. With his promotion and steady income, Jake was able to contribute to the household expenses in ways he never had before. The relief on Sarah's face each time he handed her his share of the rent or covered the grocery bill was worth every hour he'd spent at the dealership. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Sarah turned to him with a soft smile. "I'm proud of you, Jake," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've grown into someone your dad would have admired. I just hope you know how far you've come." Jake swallowed hard, his chest tight with gratitude. Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." Sarah shook her head. "You did this, Jake. You're the one who made it happen." Late one night, after a long shift at the dealership, Jake found himself sitting on the balcony of their apartment, the cool breeze ruffling his hair. The city stretched out before him, the distant hum of traffic a constant backdrop. He thought about everything that had led him here. The eviction notice, the long days at school, the moments of doubt when he'd wondered if he was good enough. He pulled out the letter from the technical program, reading it again under the pale light of the moon. It was proof that he could do more, be more. But it wasn't just about him. It was about Sarah, who had worked tirelessly to keep their family afloat. It was about Tom, who had taken a chance on him when no one else would. It was about Luis, who had taught him that experience was earned, not given. Jake leaned back against the chair, a rare smile tugging at his lips. The journey hadn't been easy, but he wouldn't trade it for anything. Every challenge, every late night, every setback had shaped him into the person he was becoming. "This is just the beginning," he said softly to himself, the words a promise and a declaration. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Jake was no longer afraid. He had the tools, the determination, and the belief that he could build a future worth fighting for. And as the first light of dawn broke over the city, he felt ready to take the next step.